Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Al Bowman, the former president of Illinois State University and current executive director of the Illinois Board of Higher Education. We talk to Mr. Bowman about the state's struggles to fund public universities, the responsibilities of a university president, and what he would like Illinois politicians to know about higher education. This runs about 40 minutes.
Al Bowman, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Good to be here.
We, first of all, before we get into some of the issues of higher education, let's just introduce people to what is it that the Board of Higher Education does?
Well, I guess the average person on the street probably is not aware of the work that's done here. You know, the 30-second answer is that we really serve two major functions. We are, first of all, a regulatory agency. We're the agency that grants operating authority for any institution that wants to operate in the state of Illinois. We also approve all academic degree programs. And then secondly, we play an advocacy role for the higher ed sector. And we spend a fair amount of time recommending budgets both for operating and capital budgets for public higher education. We work with the General Assembly, the Governor's Office, of course, leadership to do that.
Some people, Governor Blagojevich and maybe to some extent Governor Rauner, have been critical from time to time, talking about bloated bureaucracies in higher education. Do you ever, when someone submits their budget, say, now wait a minute, you're going to have to sharpen the pencil a little bit more, that's too much? Sure.
Well, if you look at higher ed funding, state funding, over the last 16 years, it's actually declined by about half. And of course, as that's happened, universities have backfilled with tuition revenue, so our tuition rates have increased. This notion about bloat, I think,
well, let me just, I want to get into that.
Sure.
But I just, to understand what your function as an entity.
Sure.
Do you ever question the budget of someone? Is that your role? And if so, do they have to follow and go back and do it? Or can they just say, Mr. Bowman, we think we're fine on the budget. We're going to keep it like it is?
We look very closely at the recommendations that come forward from the institutions. We don't replace the functions of individual governing boards. So the budgets that reach our desks have already been vetted by local governing boards in great detail. So at the point they reach us, they're ready to move forward. We play a pretty important role in evaluating capital requests, and we look very closely at those. We work with the institutions to prioritize those, and our recommendations then, of course, go to the General Assembly and the Governor.
And sometimes those of us who are familiar with these things skip over some details. I just want to emphasize when we say a capital request, there's the operational budget and then there's the capital budget. The capital budget is for things like buildings, infrastructure, right. Buildings, air conditioning units, maybe a football stadium or something like that.
Yeah, the athletic facilities would not be included in those capital requests. Those would be funded locally by the institutions and paid for with athletic revenue, student fee revenue. But you know, I think it's fair for anyone to ask, are these budgets full of administrative bloat that's unnecessary? And you know, I think an example from my own experience, I think, puts that narrative to rest. When I was president of Illinois State University, my staff consisted of a chief of staff who was full-time, who also doubled as the media director for the institution. And I also had 3 full-time clerical staff members. And that was the extent of the administration in the president's office. And we had a budget that was over $350 million, over 3,000 employees, And in my opinion, that's a pretty lean operation. And as I look across sort of the middle management ranks at institutions, looking at deans and department heads, those individuals don't have large administrative staffs to do their work. Is there some waste? There always is in a big organization, but I don't think it's anywhere near as extensive as the public narrative tends to be.
And I think you pointed out in a speech recently that you gave, I may have the number wrong, but it was something, and you alluded to it earlier, the state of Illinois now funds higher education at about, what, 45% or so less than what it did in 2002?
Approximately 49% less than it did in 2002. So we've had 16 years of declining state support. Illinois is not out of the ordinary. Nearly every state across the country is spending less on higher education today than they were prior to the recession.
And one of the things, I think there's a confusion on the street because we typically don't go around thinking of these issues, but a lot of people are under the impression that if it's a state-supported institution of higher education, that the state pays for everything. But the facts are that whether it's Western Illinois, Eastern Illinois, ISU, Southern Illinois, the level of state support is going to vary by institution, but generally speaking, it's going to be probably less than half of the total operating budget. Right?
It does vary, but it varies in a fairly narrow range. When I started as a young faculty member back in 1978, state support covered almost 90% of a university's operational budget. And I think every state in the country would like to have maintained that level. And I think Illinois is one of those. Illinois has, for many, many years, prioritized higher education. I think what's changed is the pressures on state budgets, not only in Illinois but across the country. And those pressures include Medicaid, which is a very large expense, and also corrections, unfortunately.
And pensions.
And certainly pensions. If you go back to 2008 in Illinois, the state university pension payments were just under $400 million. This past year, it was $1.7 billion.
Wow.
And that occurrence, unfortunately, is a product of pension holidays, chronic underfunding of our pension system. The state has recognized that it has to catch up, and the pension ramp that's part of this attempt to get the system back to where it needs to be is very, very expensive. And so this past year, university state operating budgets equaled just over $1 billion. So state support for university operations was just over $1 billion. The pension payment last year was just under $1.7 billion, but 75% of that payment was for old pension debt. And had we not underfunded that system over the years, we would have a manageable payment for ongoing pension costs. But unfortunately, that's not the case. We're spending this year over $1.4 billion on the Department of Corrections. So we'll be spending more money on corrections than we will on university operations. And the unfortunate byproduct of that is tuition payments have been elevated to backfill for that declining state support.
Is there, how much do we pay? $1.4 billion for Department of Corrections. What is the number for higher ed?
Just over $1 billion for university operations.
And how many institutions of higher education are included in that $1 billion?
That would be all the public universities, the 12 individual campuses, as well as the community colleges. Now, the community colleges, because property tax revenue pays for the majority of their operations, their state support is less than it is for the public universities.
Which accounts, as you say, so we just to review, we greatly reduced by half almost the funding for higher education over the last 16 years or so. Right. And therefore, with rising costs and everything else, salaries, et cetera, right. That's one of the primary drivers for the rising costs of tuition payments. Right. And now we see, among other things, that people are borrowing, the students are borrowing. We talk about student loan debt right. nationwide, not just in Illinois. Overall, what would you say? I mean, the other thing that's really been in the news and, of course, damaged all the state-funded operations that we didn't have a budget for 2 years. Right. That put a lot of pressure on higher education. Where are we now as far as we just passed our second budget? We just began the fiscal year July 1. Has some of that pressure eased, and to what extent are sure. those publicly funded institutions of higher education still struggling mightily?
No, the having a budget for the second year in a row has certainly helped. It will take a number of years going forward for us to completely recover, but the recovery is underway. Universities, in order to maintain operations, had to use their reserve funds, and those dollars are now not available to invest. We also suffered some reputational damage as a result of the impasse. You know, families rightly were concerned about whether academic programs would still be there, and I think some families looked not only to the private sector but also out-of-state larger public universities as alternatives. You know, I think over time our institutions can get back to stronger footing, but it will take a while. The public higher ed system during that budget impasse saw over $2 billion of state funding drain away, and you know, you can't recover from that overnight. You know, there's been lots of conversation about student debt, and you know, every institution is doing everything they can to hold the line on tuition. You know, there are over 50 million Americans that have student debt, and it's over $1 trillion today. That's clear. One of the bright spots in Illinois is that the average debt at graduation for Illinois residents is actually less than the national average. And that one of the factors I think that gets lost in the conversation is that about over 40% of college graduates leave with zero debt.
How do they manage that?
Well, in some cases, it's a combination of family resources. Obviously, some kids get a combination of merit and need-based scholarship funds, and of course, families that are fortunate to have the resources can simply pay the full freight. But you know, if you look at the typical undergraduate who leaves college with $25,000 in debt, at today's interest rates, paying that debt back over a 10-year period, which is the typical period for student loans, you're looking at a payment of about $280 a month. And even for an entry-level position for a college graduate, that's manageable. It would be nice not to have that debt, but I think that paints a different picture than the individual who, let's say, borrows $80,000 or $100,000 and of course has very large payments. But that's not the typical picture.
Let me ask a couple of questions that I think occur to people and has been part of the general conversation, certainly in the legislature as well. We look at suggested reforms. Some of the ideas have been that we ought to have lack of duplication, that we ought to have one school designated for maybe certain curriculum, another school for certain curriculum. A, are those good ideas? And B, let me just open it up to you. If you were advising the legislature, knowing what you know, what would you tell them? These are the changes, if any, that we should be considering in Illinois.
Yeah, I think it's important that that institutions provide an array of academic programs that that reflect the institution's strengths and the workforce needs of the state and the region that institution serves. Institutions are very careful to offer academic programs that that are cost effective, that meet student demand, that that make students employable. This notion that there's a proliferation of programs that are severely under-enrolled and have limited value is simply not true. The idea that you could streamline institutional academic offerings and produce something that really, you would produce something that would look like no other institution I can point a finger at across the country. Undergraduates expect a major university to have a comprehensive array of academic offerings. Most students who begin as freshmen are not 100% clear on exactly where they're going to go in their college career, what the major is going to be. The typical student changes majors at least 3 times over the course of the 4 or 5 or 6 years that it takes to graduate. And if we want our Illinois institutions to compete both regionally and nationally, they need to look like their competitors. And you know, with the exception of institutions that have very narrow offerings, let's say in things like health sciences, universities need to offer a comprehensive array of programs. If we were to do the kind of streamlining that's been suggested, I think we would produce institutions that were not very appealing to Illinois residents.
As a president, as you were, of a university, ISU for what, 10 years as the president?
Right.
Presuming your tenure was representative of what other presidents would more or less go through, what are the kind of things, the pressures? I guess you got to deal with your staff, and there's going to be staff issues, faculty issues from time to time. I don't know to what extent you have to deal with the federal government and any regulations there. How does a president of a university spend their time, and to what extent do you engage in fundraising for the university?
Absolutely. Yeah, the modern presidency has really changed over the last 20 years, and a larger portion of that job is now consumed by fundraising, both privately and through other sources. And typically in a work week, I would spend anywhere from 30 to 40% of my time engaged in fundraising. Some of it, to an outside observer, looked like it was purely social. And of course, any president worth his or her salt will host receptions and dinners at the president's residence several nights a week, and that certainly was part of the picture. Another major portion of a president's time is spent on long-range planning, and a great deal of that is focused on being aware of trends, future trends in higher education, and helping the institution get ready for those events that are coming down the road. That is probably the most significant job of a university president.
Which is daunting, right?
It is.
Because you got to evaluate this trend, that trend, and it's almost like trying to throw a dart at the future and hopefully you're picking the right trend.
Right. You know, I think of my own experience as a faculty member starting in 1978. I'd never heard the word cybersecurity. Probably no one had.
Yeah.
But, you know, we're training students for professions that 20 years ago didn't exist. And so institutions need to stay nimble. They need to respond to changes in the workforce. And good presidents help their institutions get ready for what's coming around the corner. Managing a large workforce, of course, takes time. Most presidents typically work anywhere from 60 to 80 hours a week. It's one of those jobs where it really is a 7-day-a-week job, in part because many of the individuals that presidents need to interact with are on campus during evenings and weekends. And that's just the nature of the job.
You know,
I think it's one of the most satisfying positions anyone could have. I thoroughly enjoyed my 10 years in the job. It's challenging not just because of the time demands, but you're involved in so many different aspects of the institution, and in a lot of ways, you're like the mayor of a small city. And it's professionally, it's just very, very satisfying.
yeah, it's not a job that ever gets boring. There's always the
Not at
challenges, sometimes too many,
true.
right?
That's true. And yeah, in the case of Illinois State University with 3,000 employees, you know, there are going to be challenges. People will get into trouble. There's always something to keep you occupied.
Well, and the thing is, I sometimes say to people, even at a high school, we don't think of these purposes. They're purposes for education, whether
Sure.
high school or higher education. But if you look at the economic impact, when you said the ISU was 300, or as the University of Illinois, with 3 campuses, I'm going to take the hospital out of that for a moment. Their annual budget's about $4 billion.
Right.
And if you looked at ISU, $350 million, most people would think that's a sizable business, especially with 3,000 people working, and the payroll that's going into that community and the ripple effect it has, so that when you have a Western, an ISU, an Eastern, a Southern, Northern Illinois, these are all economic engines of those communities and often the largest employer in those.
Yeah, in the case of Illinois State University in the Bloomington-Normal area, it is the second largest employer. Only State Farm Insurance is larger. So the reach is broad, and when you consider the impact that the graduates have on the state and national economy, the impact is tremendous.
I got my BA degree in 1977, where we're probably roughly the same age, I would guess. And
Sure.
but you know, I look at I went to a community college for part of that. I got my master's degree in the 90s after having been out of school for about 12 years. When I look, and I bumped into the internet when I was in grad school in the early 90s. It seems to me one of the things that we do as individuals is we take our life experience and apply it as if it's still applicable.
Sure.
The change in our society because of the internet is so much faster than when we were growing up, that it seems to me that the role of higher education is not, in some cases it's the same, but in other cases it's different because of that level of change. I now work on the internet. I now work on websites, and the web, you know, none of this existed even when I was going through my undergraduate.
Sure.
It certainly seems to me that community colleges, sometimes people don't want to go back and get a 4-year degree. They just want to get retooled for doing websites, or now we're going to have I can't think of the term, the new reality, ultra reality machines.
Virtual reality.
Virtual reality.
Right. Mm-hmm.
There's going to be new jobs created. When you're in this position now, and it's almost a variation of what you did as a president of a university, where you're trying to peer into the future and say, what course should we, set the university on? When you from this position and you say, what are the roles of higher education institutions in 2018 versus 20 years ago or 40 years ago? How has it changed, and what's the discussion among professionals of higher education across the country? What trends are we looking at?
Well, I think a large trend, and I think this is extremely important, the importance of post-secondary training is absolutely critical in our highly technical society. And if you go back 30, 50 years ago, when there were plentiful manufacturing positions, it was possible for a high school graduate who was physically able to earn a middle-class income and have secure employment for a lifetime. And with automation, the world has changed. And one of the things that we've recognized is that in order to ensure that an individual is ready to take their place in the modern workforce, they'll need additional training beyond high school. And so as a country, we've set a goal of reaching 60% for 60% of the working age population to have some sort of post-secondary credential by the year 2025. And in the case of Illinois, we're moving toward that goal. We're slightly ahead of the national average. But every high school student has to understand that additional training beyond high school is certainly essential. If you look at the jobs that were created since the end of the recession in 2008, 70% of those new jobs went to people that either had a college degree or some college training. It's simply not possible for most high school graduates to have the kinds of skills that employers are looking for. So, when I talk to people about what I'm doing at the Illinois Board of Higher Education, one of the questions that sometimes comes up is, does everyone need a 4-year college degree? And of course, there's an easy answer to that. Absolutely not. What everyone needs is training beyond the 4-year high school credential. And of course, we encourage students to consider all their options. The 4-year college experience is one of many good options that are available.
When people ask, as they do from time to time, just in general, is a college education worth the investment?
Sure.
And we talked earlier about the debt level that a lot of students are carrying, or just the savings that middle-class families save a lot of money to send their children to college. How do we assess whether they're getting value for their investment?
Sure. I think it's an easy question to answer, and if you look at 3 variables: lifetime earnings for college graduates, health, and longevity. And college graduates, on average, earn $1 million more than a high school graduate over the course of a working career. College graduates have longer life expectancy, and they are healthier. Those are 3 pretty good reasons that I think make this degree worth the investment. Is it possible to earn a secure middle-class lifestyle without a college degree? Absolutely. But in order to do that in today's world, specialized training is going to be needed.
There's so many things we could talk about, we don't have time to get into everything, but I was talking to a high school principal once, and he said federal funding is about 3% of our budget and about 90% of my headaches. Does the federal government have a role in higher education, and to what extent is it a large role, big role, and to what extent is it providing headaches?
It's an extremely important role, and a large portion of the federal involvement involves student financial aid, and of course the federal Pell program is extremely important for particularly for students whose families make under $50,000 a year. We as a country, I think, have been very generous in supporting that federal Pell program. The federal government also is involved in funding important research activity that takes place at major universities all across the country. And many of the advances that have been made in healthcare are a direct result of federal funding from the National Science Foundation, NIH, and other funding agencies. And I think most university administrators would tell you that yes, there is paperwork involved. There are always complications associated with federal investment, but it's clearly worth it. Another, and while it's not a federal investment in the case of Illinois and with financial aid, we have one of the largest need-based financial aid programs in the country in our MAP program, the Monetary Award Program. We will spend $401 million on MAP funding this year.
In state funding?
In state funding. And those dollars are typically paired with the federal Pell program that allows students to offset what ordinarily would be paid for by families if those families had those resources.
One thing I would point out to people, we talked about the state fund. I think Southern Illinois University, I don't remember exactly, but they are funding, I think state funding accounts for maybe 40% or so of their budget. Then you have tuition. But speaking of the federal government, one of the things too is that there's all these grants. Of course, there's some of the foundation grants they can go after.
Sure.
But they also have, you say that like this, programs like the National Institutes of Health or the Department of Transportation, where different professors or departments may apply for a federal grant.
Right.
And sometimes those are going to be measured in the millions of dollars.
Absolutely.
Over multiple years.
Yes.
That would also perhaps employ some students or help to defray some of the costs. It would be applied to working with maybe local businesses and doing some of the research on that. So I just think sometimes people stand back and they haven't been to college in 30 years or something. They think these are hermetically sealed and not interacting with the community, but I think sometimes we miss that interaction that goes on with the institutions.
Yeah. There's an awful lot of interaction both between institutions and federal agencies, and also a great deal of interaction between the business community and institutions. And in my own experience at Illinois State University, we launched a nursing program in 1999. And over the years, we've invested in that program. And some of that investment came from the state. Some of it came from institutional funds, but also some of it came from the federal government. And we received, during my time as president there, over $7 million in federal funding for that nursing program as we paid for equipment that allowed nursing students to do simulation exercises, very expensive equipment and software and hardware that is really necessary. In the case of business investment, a good recent example is the university began a cybersecurity program, and part of the investment for that program came from a grant from State Farm Insurance. The company has a need for that kind of professional, and they made the investment to help the institution launch the program.
Before we close out, let me say this. We talked earlier that with the 2 years without a state budget, with the already previous to that decline in state support, we're just now getting back to where we've quit shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak.
Sure.
But if you were advising lawmakers listening to this, or you talk to them periodically, and they,
Absolutely.
what would you want them to know, or the governor, or Mr. Pritzker? We don't know who the next governor is going to be. What should they know about the role of higher education, and anything that you would want to pass on to them?
Sure.
What are the important things for them to know?
Well, and I think both sides of the aisle recognize that the higher ed sector is very important to the state's economy, not only in terms of training the future workforce, but the important research that's done at these institutions that benefit both the state and the country. I also like to talk about the money that goes into higher ed as an investment in the state's future. While it certainly uses today's dollars and it's a significant investment, it's an investment that will pay off for us. And one of the features in Illinois that I think makes us competitive for, let's say, the Amazon headquarters is the strength of our public and private institutions in this state. We have our universities have a very good national and international reputation, and that draws business to the state, and it certainly draws young recent graduates to cities like Chicago.
I know for myself, just going to some of the schools, the other thing, and probably anyone who works or lives in a community where there's a university, they also just add a cultural input
Sure.
because you have ongoing
Right.
great speakers or panel discussions and different things, kind of an intellectual aspect to community life that no private business is going to be coordinating, or no one else really kind of fulfills that role, generally speaking. Maybe a civic club here and there might.
True. The economic impact of both public and private universities in Illinois is estimated to be at over $50 billion. And this agency is in the process of updating that number to see exactly what it is in 2018. But that's a very, very large impact on the state. And I think it's one that probably the average person is likely not aware of.
Well, Bowman, we appreciate you taking the time to explain what the role is of the Board of Higher Education, and for giving us your input, and hopefully we can do this again.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you.